The night settles quietly around you, and in that quiet, history softens enough for us to approach it gently. Some stories echo across generations, not because they bring comfort, but because they remind us how one life, shaped by shadows and belief, can alter the course of millions. Tonight, we walk slowly into one of the most unsettling chapters of modern history, the life of a man whose choices built a storm that reshaped the world, not with judgment nor with praise, but with a calm understanding of how a single path became a global turning point. This is a story carried by deserts, by silence, by ideology, and by the haunting consequences of conviction. If these words come to you softly in the stillness of night, and if they help you travel through history with a little more peace, let this channel stay close by your side too, guiding you gently through stories that shaped our world. The story of Osama bin Laden begins far from the noise of the world he would one day disturb. It begins in a land where the horizon stretches endlessly, where the desert meets the sky in a soft, shimmering blur, and where silence carries its own kind of ancient wisdom. In Saudi Arabia, a place shaped by faith, tradition, and the quiet persistence of time, his early life unfolded with a stillness that almost hides the shadows that would later grow from it. The boy he once was lived in a world of contrasts, a world where immense wealth stood beside deep religious devotion, and where modernity touched only the edges of a culture rooted in old sands. His childhood home was filled with marble floors, wide rooms, and the soft hum of privilege. Yet outside those doors lay a country defined by simplicity and spiritual discipline. This duality created a strange rhythm in his early years. He grew up with access to luxury many could not imagine, but his surroundings, his teachers, and the worldviews guiding him were shaped by conservative interpretations of faith. These two forces pressed quietly on his young mind, shaping a boy who often felt more compelled by austerity and spirituality than by comfort and abundance. He was not known for rebelliousness or wild energy. Instead, he carried himself with a kind of quiet seriousness even as a child. There was something introspective in him, something that leaned toward contemplation rather than play. Teachers described him as reserved, polite, and deeply attentive. A boy drawn toward discipline, routine, and the structure offered by religious study. While other children might lose themselves in laughter, he often stood slightly apart, observing rather than participating, as though searching for meaning even when none was required of him. Yet the world around him was changing quickly. The Middle East of the 1970s was a place caught between modern forces pushing in from all sides and old traditions anchoring themselves stubbornly in the past. Oil wealth was reshaping cities, bringing skyscrapers, highways, and foreign ideas into a region that had spent centuries unshaken by outside influence. As the landscape expanded outward, so too did the pressures placed upon young minds trying to reconcile identity in a world shifting beneath their feet. Osama absorbed much of this quietly, as if the tension between old and new settled somewhere deep inside him. He watched as his country struggled with how to balance faith and modernization, how to embrace progress without losing its soul. These contradictions stirred something in him, a longing to commit to what felt pure, unchanging, eternal. His interpretation of faith began to harden, not violently, not abruptly, but slowly, like stone forming grain by grain beneath desert winds. His family was enormous, connected, and powerful, yet he often gravitated toward solitude. Even in group settings, he found comfort in being slightly apart. He spent long hours reflecting, sometimes studying, sometimes simply sitting with his thoughts. There was a sensitivity in him, a sense of purpose that had not yet found direction, like a compass spinning in quiet circles. The modesty he adopted, the seriousness he displayed, and the humility he tried to embody were all signs of someone trying to align himself with something larger than he could yet describe. And while he lived in privilege, he admired austerity. He felt drawn to stories of simplicity, sacrifice, and faith lived with severe devotion. In this tension, between his wealthy upbringing and the humble lifestyle he increasingly idealized, something began to form inside him. A belief, conviction, a narrative about what mattered and what did not. These early ideas were not dangerous in themselves, but they were seeds. seeds that, in the right conditions, could grow into something unyielding. As adolescence arrived, he began to absorb the political moods of the region. The world around him was stirring with conflict. Ideological battles, global power struggles, and wars that echoed across borders. Though still young, he listened, watched, and internalized the sense that the Muslim world was under pressure. He gravitated toward religious teachers who spoke of purity and righteousness, voices that framed the world as a place of moral battles rather than simple political disputes. These mentors fed his hunger for meaning, giving him a language through which he could interpret the world's tensions. He was particularly moved by stories of individuals who left comfort behind to defend what they believed sacred. Martyrdom, sacrifice, and heroism, framed through the lens of faith, captivated him. For a boy who felt out of place in luxurious halls and drawn toward a higher spiritual purpose, these narratives resonated deeply. They offered a version of life that felt noble, disciplined, and certain. Everything he believed modernity was eroding. Yet even then, his path was not fixed. There were still moments when he could have turned toward a quieter life, managing business interests, contributing to development projects, or following the traditional routes laid out for sons of wealthy families. But something in him leaned toward the dramatic, the absolute, the uncompromising. Certainty became a kind of compass. He believed that clarity of purpose lay not in negotiation or adaptation, but in unwavering devotion to an idealized version of faith. And so, quietly, almost imperceptibly, the early foundations of his identity solidified. A boy shaped by strict teachings, a world in transition, and the weight of personal conviction began to step into adulthood with a worldview already narrowing, already hardening, already searching for a cause that could hold all the intensity he carried inside. What remained unknown to him, and to the world watching from afar, was how profoundly these early impressions would shape not only his own life, but the lives of millions. The young man emerging from these years was one still searching, still molding himself, still listening to the echoes of his upbringing, echoes that would soon lead him far from home, into the mountains of a land at war. And so, as the night deepened around him, the quiet beginnings of his life prepared to move toward a storm he had not yet imagined. As Osama stepped more firmly into adolescence, his world began to widen in gentle but decisive ways. He was no longer just a quiet boy observing the tensions of his surroundings. He was now a young man shaped by the weight of expectations, cultural, familial, and spiritual. In a society built on hierarchy and lineage, his family name carried influence that reached far beyond the walls of their home. Yet he often seemed untouched by the comfort that name offered. Instead, he walked with a sense of modesty that appeared almost paradoxical for someone raised in privilege, as if he believed excess might cloud the clarity he sought. School life introduced him to a broader mix of ideas. He encountered classmates from varied backgrounds, each carrying their own interpretations of faith and identity. While some drifted toward the modern currents reshaping Saudi Arabia, Osama leaned further into the certainties offered by conservative teachers and preachers. He absorbed their messages with quiet intensity, finding a deep and comforting rhythm in the rigid structure of their beliefs. These teachings gave him a sense of direction, something firm to hold in a rapidly shifting world. He began to spend more time studying religious texts, sometimes late into the night, letting the stillness of the early hours deepen his commitment. The desert air around him, dry, warm, and timeless, seemed to echo the values he admired: simplicity, endurance, unwavering strength. In these moments, he felt a kind of belonging that eluded him in social settings. It was as though the world made the most sense when its noise faded, leaving only devotion and discipline in its place. Despite his growing seriousness, there was a gentleness in him during these years. He was known to be polite, generous, and thoughtful, traits that made him well-liked even among those who did not share his intensifying worldview. But beneath this calm exterior, something firmer was taking shape, a conviction that the modern world was drifting away from what he believed to be sacred truths. The more he watched society embrace change, the more determined he became to anchor himself in the past. This tension created a quiet conflict inside him, a world shifting outward and a heart pulling inward. By the late 1970s, the environment around him became even more charged. The Middle East was stirring with new political movements, revolutionary calls, and ideological clashes. Young men across the region began asking themselves who they were in a world split between tradition and transformation. For Osama, these questions struck deeply. He saw the region's struggles not as political disputes, but as spiritual tests. Everything became a matter of identity measured against devotion, and he chose the strictest version of that path with unwavering commitment. His father's wealth provided opportunities few could ever dream of, yet he increasingly treated those resources not as comforts but as tools. While others in his position might have drifted toward business or luxury, he used his resources to deepen his connection to religious study and charitable work. He funded projects that aligned with his beliefs, supported religious institutions, and forged connections with scholars who reinforced the worldview he was forming. In these interactions, he found mentors who praised firmness, sacrifice, and absolute faith. The admiration he received from them strengthened his sense of purpose, making him feel as though he was being shaped for something significant, something righteous. But purpose, when unchecked by broader perspectives, can become a narrow tunnel. And for the young man he was becoming, that tunnel grew darker and more rigid as he sought meaning through increasingly uncompromising interpretations. He began to view moral clarity as something achieved through rejection rather than balance, rejecting modernity, rejecting Western influence, rejecting any worldview that did not conform to his own evolving convictions. With each passing year, his beliefs hardened into an identity anchored not only in faith, but in resistance. Yet these internal shifts happened quietly, almost invisibly. From the outside, he still appeared calm, soft-spoken, and disciplined. His large family, scattered across many households and responsibilities, saw him as a pious young man following a respectable path. No one could yet see how tightly his values were winding around him, how deeply he was absorbing the region's tensions, or how the narratives of sacrifice and struggle were beginning to shape his imagination. What seemed like devotion was slowly turning into something more rigid, a lens through which he would eventually interpret the world as a battlefield of ideals. Then, in the late 1970s, the news coming from Afghanistan began to ripple through the region. Stories of invasion, resistance, and suffering spread quickly. For many, these stories were distant tragedies. For some, they were calls for humanitarian aid. But for Osama, still searching for a definitive purpose, they stirred something powerful. He felt drawn toward the idea of defending faith beyond borders, of stepping into a role larger than himself. The conflict in Afghanistan was not yet his, but the idea of it began to settle in his thoughts like a distant drumbeat. He began to follow the developments closely, listening to reports, discussing them with mentors, and imagining what role he might play in a struggle framed as both political and spiritual. The mountains of Afghanistan, harsh and vast, became symbols in his mind, places where devotion could be proven, where clarity could be found, where purpose could transform into action. He did not yet know how deeply this conflict would shape his life. He only felt a pull, soft at first, like a thread tugging at the edges of his consciousness. And in the quiet of those formative years, that pull began to strengthen. Soon, the young man shaped by silence, privilege, and spiritual certainty would step toward a world in turmoil, believing he was answering a righteous call. And as the night deepened around his journey, the shadows ahead grew longer, waiting for him in distant mountains he had not yet seen. The final years of the 1970s settled over Osama's life like a slow-gathering storm, quiet at first, but carrying an unmistakable charge in the air. He was still the reserved young man known for politeness, humility, and a disciplined devotion to faith. Yet beneath this gentle exterior, something more defined, more forceful, was beginning to crystallize inside him. His beliefs were no longer simply inherited. They were becoming chosen, sharpened, and anchored with an intensity that set him apart. With every passing month, the contrast between his inner world and the world around him grew sharper. Modern life in Saudi Arabia surged forward with new technologies, glittering buildings, Western education programs, and economic transformations. For many young people, these changes opened doors to excitement and possibility. But for Osama, each change felt like a step farther from the purity he sought. He spent long evenings in the quiet corners of mosques, listening to scholars who warned of the moral dilution that came with rapid modernization. Their sermons blended history, faith, and fear, painting the world as a place where truth was slipping through society's fingers unless protected by steadfast devotion. These messages resonated deeply with him. They did not push him toward extremity all at once, but they reinforced his growing belief that stability could only be achieved by looking backward, not forward. The more he absorbed these teachings, the more he reconsidered his place in the world. He no longer viewed himself as the son of a wealthy businessman, destined for corporate success. Instead, he imagined himself as someone called to defend moral order, someone who must use his privilege not for personal gain but for spiritual service. This sense of duty wrapped itself around him slowly, like a cloak he had not intended to wear but now could not take off. His family still saw him as a gentle, studious young man, quiet, respectful, and humble, and in many ways he still was. He was known for helping the poor, donating generously, and showing kindness to strangers. These acts were admired, even celebrated. What no one saw was how these actions were beginning to form the foundation of an identity centered on sacrifice and purpose. He was not merely being charitable. He was training himself for a life he felt must rise above comfort. But purpose is a powerful thing, especially when it takes hold of someone young and searching. And as the voices around him, teachers, preachers, mentors, grew more insistent about the need to defend faith across borders, Osama found himself absorbing their urgency. He began to understand struggle not only as a spiritual metaphor, but as a duty that might require real, physical action. The news from Afghanistan intensified this shift. What started as distant headlines had now become a daily part of his thoughts. The Soviet invasion was portrayed as a brutal oppression, a violation of the Muslim world, and a call for righteous defense. In gatherings across the Middle East, young men spoke with fire in their voices about the responsibility to stand with Afghan fighters. They romanticized hardship, sleeping in mountains, carrying rifles, resisting a superpower with nothing but faith and grit. These stories affected Osama profoundly. They awakened in him a longing he did not yet fully understand, a yearning to step beyond the safe boundaries of his life, to enter a world where belief was proven through action, not just words. The mountains of Afghanistan became symbols of purity and resolve in his imagination. Harsh, unforgiving, and untouched by the modern world, they called to him like a distant prayer. He spent hours discussing the conflict with scholars and activists who were beginning to organize support networks for the Afghan resistance. They spoke of courage, martyrdom, and the honor of defending the oppressed. They insisted that true believers were defined not by comfort, but by struggle. These conversations sparked something intense within him, a merging of faith and identity into something firmer than either alone. Yet this transformation did not manifest in outbursts or declarations. If anything, he grew quieter, more contemplative. His silences became deeper, his eyes more distant, as though he was looking past the room he sat in and toward another horizon entirely. Family members noticed the shift but could not name it. They simply thought he had become exceptionally devout. In truth, he was becoming something else. Someone preparing internally for a life that no one around him yet imagined. He began to travel more frequently, sometimes to attend lectures, sometimes to visit religious scholars whose reputations were growing across the region. These mentors saw in him a young man with influence, discipline, and a hunger for purpose. They encouraged him gently but persistently, teaching him that leadership was not only about guiding others but about embodying a moral ideal, even if that ideal demanded withdrawal from the comforts of society. By now, Osama had also begun forming quiet connections with individuals involved in humanitarian aid for Afghan refugees. Their stories, the wounded fighters, the displaced families, the destroyed villages, deepened his emotional investment. He started financing small projects, sending money to support relief efforts. His generosity was sincere, but also tied to a growing belief that he was meant to play a role larger than simple charity. Every act of giving reinforced his conviction that wealth was a tool placed in his hands for a sacred purpose. And with each passing day, that purpose seemed to point toward Afghanistan. He imagined the mountains often rugged, vast, and demanding. He imagined the men who fought there, surviving on belief alone. He imagined what it would mean to stand among them, to match his convictions with action, to see himself transformed by hardship into someone worthy of the path he believed he was being called to follow. This internal pull created a new kind of quiet within him, not the calm of innocence, but the calm of direction. A stillness that takes hold when a young man believes, with complete sincerity, that destiny is waiting for him beyond the horizon. By the end of the decade, the direction of his life was clear to him, even if he spoke of it only in fragments. The world he had known, a world of privilege, structure, and safety, felt too small, too soft, too distant from the purity he sought. A conviction was growing inside him, steady and unshakable. Faith must be defended. Sacrifice must be made. Purpose must be lived, not simply believed. And somewhere beyond the desert, in the cold, rugged heights of Afghanistan, he felt that purpose calling him more strongly with each passing day. Soon he would answer it. And when he did, the world would begin to change in ways no one around him yet understood. When the 1980s dawned, the world around Osama shifted in a way that felt almost fated, as though the quiet unease he had carried through adolescence was now being echoed in events unfolding far beyond his home. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan had become more than a distant headline. It was now a storm drawing thousands of young men into its winds. Across the Middle East, voices rose in crowded mosques, in university corridors, in shaded courtyard gatherings. Voices describing the suffering of Afghan villagers, the resistance of their fighters, and the devastation left in the wake of conflict. For many, these were tragedies to be mourned at a distance. But for Osama, still young and searching for clarity, they felt like a summons. He heard stories of entire villages emptied overnight, of families crossing mountains in bitter cold, of fighters with little more than determination standing against tanks and aircraft. These accounts reached him like whispered testimonies from another world. Harsh, painful, but pulling at something deep within him. The young man who had grown up yearning for purity and purpose now saw this conflict through a sharply spiritual lens, believing it to be a defining struggle of the era. Yet there was no sudden transformation, no dramatic declaration. The shift inside him was gradual, like a tide rising beneath still waters. At first, he responded in ways that seemed entirely humanitarian. He funded relief projects, supplied aid to refugees, and met with organizers who traveled between Saudi Arabia and the Afghan-Pakistani border. These encounters left strong impressions on him. Men returned from the mountains with scars and stories, speaking in quiet tones about resilience and loss. Their faces carried both exhaustion and conviction, a combination that struck him deeply. As he listened, he felt the boundaries of his world begin to stretch. The idea of Afghanistan no longer belonged to faraway maps or news reports. It grew into something almost mythic in his mind, a place where devotion was tested not in comfort, but in survival. A land where belief was expressed through endurance rather than study. And he wondered, quietly but persistently, what it meant to live a life shaped entirely by conviction. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia itself was changing. The same modernization that unsettled him in his youth was accelerating. Cities expanded rapidly, new technologies flooded daily life, and Western influences grew more visible. For many, these changes promised opportunity. For others, they signaled a drifting away from familiar values. Osama found himself increasingly aligned with those who felt a fear, not of progress but of cultural erosion. Their conversations fed his sense that the world was shifting too quickly, unanchored, moving further from the principles he believed should guide it. Afghanistan became a symbol of resistance to that drift, a place where, in his mind, people clung fiercely to identity in the face of an overwhelming force. It represented something he felt was slipping away elsewhere, a kind of purity, a unity rooted in hardship and faith. These thoughts deepened as he met more activists and organizers, some practical, others ideological. They spoke of sacrifice with reverence, of struggle as a responsibility. They did not speak to him as a wealthy young man destined for business, but as someone they believed could support a larger cause. Their words were persuasive not because they were fiery, but because they echoed the conviction already growing quietly within him. Still, he hesitated. He had always been deliberate with his choices, careful with his steps. Traveling to a war-torn land was not a decision he would make lightly. But again and again, the stories returned to him. The displaced families, the wounded fighters, the harsh mountains standing like silent witnesses over a country trying to survive. These images settled into his thoughts like unanswered questions. Would he remain on the outside, watching from safety, or would he cross into the world whose struggle now filled his mind? Family members noticed his deepening focus. He spoke more often of Afghanistan, though always in measured tones. They saw in him a seriousness that seemed admirable, devotion, generosity, discipline. What they could not see were the layers beneath. The growing belief that he was meant to take part in something beyond his own borders, something he saw as both spiritual duty and personal destiny. His first trip toward the Afghan-Pakistani border was cautious, more exploratory than committed. But the journey itself left a mark on him. The landscapes he passed, stretches of desert, distant ranges of stone, wind-swept plains that seemed endless, felt like a physical reflection of the inner journey he had been on for years. When he finally reached the border regions crowded with refugees, orphan children, and fighters recovering from battle, the reality of suffering confronted him with an intensity no sermon or report had ever carried. He moved through these camps quietly, almost reverently. He listened more than he spoke. The stories he had once imagined now unfolded in front of him in faces that were tired, hopeful, afraid, determined. The contrast between these harsh scenes and the sheltered world he came from struck him deeply. It strengthened his conviction that neutrality was not an option, that privilege demanded responsibility, and responsibility demanded action. He returned home changed, not in appearance and not in behavior, but in direction. The pull he had once felt as a distant whisper was now something firmer, an internal compass pointing toward the mountains he had only glimpsed. The clarity he had long searched for seemed to gather around him slowly, like mist forming before dawn. He did not yet speak openly of what he intended. He simply continued preparing, funding more projects, meeting more organizers, deepening his network, and studying the situation with growing intensity. And with each passing month, the path before him felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. He believed the mountains were waiting for him. He believed the suffering he had seen demanded more than sympathy. He believed the conflict had carved out a space where his devotion could be tested and proven. And soon, he would follow that belief to the rugged edges of Afghanistan, stepping toward a land that would change not only his life, but the future in ways few yet imagined. Night fell over the Swat Valley with an almost sacred stillness. Only the distant murmur of the river broke the silence, winding through the darkness like a whispered warning from the earth itself. Yet for the young men gathering in hidden corners of the village, silence no longer meant peace. It meant urgency. It meant preparation. Word had spread quietly, carried from ear to ear, from prayer hall to marketplace. The mountains are calling. The resistance is forming. Some answered without hesitation. Others waited, torn between fear and duty. But one truth echoed everywhere. Something irreversible had begun. Far above the valley, lanterns flickered in a secluded mountain hut where an elder, known simply as Haji Sahib, sat with a map spread before him. His beard was white with age, but his eyes carried the resolve of a man who had witnessed too many broken promises, too many invaders, too many cycles of hope turned to ash. He traced his finger along the jagged ridges. "These mountains," he said softly, "have buried empires, but they also birth movements." Around him sat a circle of young men, students, laborers, farmers, each holding the weight of a future they were only beginning to understand. Some looked terrified, others looked determined. All of them were listening. A knock interrupted the quiet planning. It was the messenger, breathless, dust-covered, urgency carved into his expression. "They have begun moving into the lower valley villages," he whispered. "Checkpoints, searches, questioning everyone." The room stiffened. This was the moment they all knew would come. The moment when resistance was no longer theory, no longer planning, but a living reality pressing in from every direction. Haji Sahib closed his eyes. "So it begins," he murmured. Outside, the night wind swept down from the peaks carrying with it a chilling omen. History was shifting again, and every man in that hut could feel the weight of it pressing on his shoulders. Somewhere in the silence between heartbeats, a decision was made, not with words, but with the quiet, unspoken agreement of fate. Tomorrow they would move deeper into the mountains. Tomorrow a movement would take its first breath. Dawn rose gently over the valley, painting the sky with pale strokes of gold and ash. But beneath that quiet beauty, the air carried a tension that every villager could feel in their bones. Something unseen had entered the land, a shadow that watched, measured, and waited. Before sunrise, the young men who had gathered in the mountain hut began their ascent toward the higher peaks. The path was narrow, carved only by goat herders and travelers long forgotten. Loose stones slid under their feet. Frost clung stubbornly to patches of earth untouched by the weak morning light. For many, it was their first true journey into the mountains as fighters, not shepherds or wanderers. There was no turning back now. Haji Sahib walked at the front, his steps steady and unhurried despite his age. Every few moments, he paused to look back at the line of determined faces behind him. The mountains, he had once said, tested a man before accepting him. These young men were being tested now. Far below, the valley slowly awakened. Smoke rose from kitchen fires, roosters called into the cold morning air, and mothers stepped outside to draw water, unaware that their sons were already becoming part of a new, unfolding chapter of history. As the group climbed higher, the sound of the river faded into a distant murmur, replaced by an eerie stillness. Even the birds seemed reluctant to break the silence. Only the crunch of boots on gravel echoed along the ridge. At a narrow overlook, the men stopped to catch their breath. Before them stretched an endless chain of mountains, their peaks piercing the pale sky like ancient guardians. "This," Haji Sahib said, extending his arm toward the vast expanse, "is where empires lose their certainty and men find their purpose." His voice was soft, but in the cold morning air, it carried with a solemn weight. "You must understand what you are stepping into," he continued. "Once the mountains accept you, they will demand everything: strength, patience, sacrifice. But they will also give you something in return, a place where fear cannot reach you." The men listened in silence, each wrestling with his own fears, dreams, and doubts. Then, from behind them, a shout, sharp and urgent. Smoke rising from the lower valley. All turned. A dark plume spiraled upward from a distant village, too large for a cooking fire, too sudden to be accidental. The mountains had called them, but now the world below was calling too, with fire, with urgency, with the unmistakable signal of conflict beginning to spread. Haji Sahib bowed his head. "It has started sooner than we hoped," he whispered. "But destiny rarely waits for men to be ready." With a final look toward the burning village below, he motioned forward. "Come, we must reach the next outpost before nightfall." And so the young men continued their ascent, deeper into the mountains, deeper into uncertainty, deeper into a story that history would one day struggle to fully understand. The path narrowed as the day wore on, winding like a thin thread along the shoulder of the mountain. Wind swept across the ridges in long, steady breaths, carrying with it the scent of pine, dust, and something colder, the kind of chill that clings to old stories and unspoken warnings. By noon, clouds drifted low enough to brush against the men's faces. The world felt muffled, wrapped in a gray veil that swallowed sound and softened every outline. Each footstep seemed quieter. Each breath rose like ghostly mist. Osama walked near the center of the group, his pace steady but thoughtful. His eyes lingered on the jagged cliffs above, the steep ravines below, the horizon where mountains folded into mountains. These heights stirred something inside him, a strange mix of awe and solemn purpose, as if the peaks themselves whispered ancient oaths he had not yet learned to understand. Haji Sahib paused beneath a towering cliff, placing a hand against the cold stone as though greeting an old companion. "This pass," he murmured, "has watched men come and go for centuries. Warriors, nomads, seekers, and the lost. Whatever you carry in your heart, the mountains will reveal it." Osama felt a quiet shiver, not of fear, but recognition, as if some invisible threshold had been crossed. The group resumed their march. Hours passed. Their breaths became heavier. Their shadows stretched long across the rock. They walked under ledges where sunlight never touched, and through clearings where sudden bursts of light felt almost holy. Then, near a high plateau, the silence broke. A distant thud rolled through the valley like muted thunder. Another followed, heavier this time, stirring loose stones along the cliff edge. The young men exchanged uneasy glances. Haji Sahib raised a hand, signaling them to stop. From the far side of the mountains came another sound, sharper, metallic, echoing faintly across the empty sky. The unmistakable crack of gunfire carried on the wind. War was no longer a distant rumor. It was at their doorstep. Osama's breath slowed as he listened, not with fear, but with a deep, haunting calm. The moment felt inevitable, like a storm he had sensed long before the first drop fell. "We are close now," Haji Sahib said quietly. "The outpost lies just beyond that ridge. Whatever awaits us, remember, the mountains shape men differently when they stand at the edge of conflict." They continued upward, the path now steeper, the air thinner. Each step felt heavier, not just from fatigue but from the weight of what they were approaching. As the sun dipped behind a towering peak, the world grew dim and blue. Shadows stretched like long arms across the stone. The wind grew colder, whispering through the cracks with a low, mournful voice. Finally, as twilight settled, the outpost came into view. A small cluster of stone huts clinging to the edge of a cliff, smoke rising gently from a narrow chimney. But something felt wrong. No movement, no voices, no figures waiting to greet them, just silence. A silence too still, too absolute. Haji Sahib's steps slowed. "Stay close," he murmured, "and be ready." The men tightened their formation, breath soft, heart steady. Whatever waited inside the outpost would mark the next turning in their story. A quiet shift, a darkening of the horizon, a truth that could not be unlearned. And as they approached the first hut, the last light of sunset slipped behind the mountains, leaving them standing at the edge of night. Night settled over the mountains like a heavy cloak, deepening every shadow and sharpening every sound. The wind had quieted, leaving behind a stillness so complete that even the faint rustle of loose gravel beneath their boots seemed intrusive. The men stood just a few steps from the outpost, their breaths slow and visible in the cold air. Haji Sahib motioned for them to wait as he approached the nearest hut, a squat structure made of rough, weathered stone. The wooden door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly each time the breeze slid past it. A thin trail of smoke curled from the chimney like a memory refusing to die. Osama's heartbeat was steady but heavy, not with fear, but with anticipation. A sense that whatever lay beyond that doorway would shift the ground beneath them. Haji Sahib pushed the door open. A low groan echoed inside, followed by a silence so abrupt it felt unnatural. He stepped in slowly, hand raised, ready for anything. The others waited outside, poised between tension and uncertainty. Moments passed. Then his voice called out, calm but carrying weight. "Come." The young men entered one by one. The room was dim, lit only by a dying fire in the center. The walls were lined with blankets, satchels, and a few scattered tools. But the air held something else, the unmistakable heaviness of suffering. Near the far wall lay two men, Mujahideen fighters, wounded and wrapped in makeshift bandages. Their faces were pale, eyes sunken, but alive. One struggled to sit upright, leaning heavily against the wall as he spoke. "You came from across the pass?" His voice cracked with exhaustion. "We weren't sure anyone would. The patrols have grown heavier. They block the valley now." Haji Sahib knelt beside him. "What happened here?" The fighter exchanged a weary glance with his companion before whispering. "They found our camp. 3 days ago. We were outnumbered, forced into the mountains. Many didn't make it." A quiet wave passed through the room. Not shock, for the men had expected hardship, but the solemn confirmation of reality. War was not poetry. War was not the stories shared under warm lanterns. War was raw, cold, and painfully close. The second wounded man studied Osama for a moment. Despite his weakness, his voice held a faint spark of curiosity. "You're one of the Saudis, aren't you? The students who came to help?" Osama nodded. The man gave a tired smile. "Your journey, your sacrifice, it means more than you know." Osama felt something shift inside him. A tightening of purpose, a quiet swelling of resolve, but also a weight. The fire crackled softly, casting trembling shadows across the stone walls. Haji Sahib spoke again, gentle but firm. "Rest now. We'll tend to your wounds. Tomorrow we continue to the main camp." The fighters nodded weakly, relieved. As the men settled in, Osama moved closer to the fireplace. He sat cross-legged, letting the heat warm his chilled hands. The flames swayed and whispered, reflections dancing in his eyes. The voices of the wounded men lingered in his mind. "They found our camp. We were outnumbered. Many didn't make it." He felt the weight of those words, but he didn't flinch. Instead, something inside him hardened with quiet resolve. The mountains had shown him their first truth. Devotion without cost was just sentiment. Real devotion demanded sacrifice. He didn't yet know what that sacrifice would ask of him, but he felt ready to face it. Outside, the wind began to rise again, brushing against the stone walls like a restless spirit. The mountains seemed alive, watching, judging, waiting. Osama lifted his gaze toward the dark ceiling. Tomorrow they would descend deeper into the heart of conflict. Tomorrow the mountains would test them anew. Tomorrow he would take another step toward a destiny he still couldn't fully see. And as the fire dimmed, the night thickened around the outpost, holding its secrets close. The morning arrived quietly, without ceremony. A thin silver light seeped through the cracks of the stone hut, soft at first, then slowly spreading across the cold floor. The fire had long since faded into ash, leaving the room wrapped in a muted chill. One by one, the men stirred, stretching stiff limbs, rubbing warmth back into their fingers, and preparing themselves for another day in the mountains. Osama rose slowly, feeling the weight of the night still lingering in his bones. The whispers of the wounded fighters echoed faintly through the back of his mind. Their exhaustion, their loss, their fragile determination. All of it settled into him like a quiet imprint. He didn't fully understand why their voices had affected him so deeply, but something about their calm acceptance of suffering felt both humbling and unsettling. It reminded him that the path he had chosen was not built on ideals alone, but on the lives it touched and the lives it consumed. Outside, the air was crisp enough to sting the lungs. The early light revealed the mountain pass stretching ahead, its slopes dusted with frost. The wind, while gentle, carried a solemn tone, as though it was urging them to move carefully, to respect the terrain. Every stone, every silent cliff seemed to hold a memory of those who had walked this path before them. Haji Sahib guided them to the stream behind the outpost, its surface trembling with the faint current of glacial melt. They washed their faces, letting the cold shock them awake, grounding them back into the present. The icy water felt almost symbolic, a baptism into something harsher, heavier, more demanding than the quiet devotion of their former lives. When they returned inside, the wounded men were awake, sitting upright and wrapped in blankets. Their eyes followed Osama as he approached, offering water and a small piece of bread. One of the fighters placed a trembling hand on Osama's wrist, his voice rough but sincere. "Do not lose yourself out there," he murmured. "The mountains can shape a man, but they can also swallow him." Osama paused. Something deep within him stirred. Not fear, not doubt, but a fragile uncertainty he rarely allowed himself to feel. He didn't respond, but he nodded gently, carrying the man's warning with quiet respect. After securing the hut, the group prepared to leave. The sun climbed slowly, casting long shadows across the valley. They adjusted their scarves, tightened their boots, and lifted their packs. Haji Sahib looked over them with calm assurance, as though measuring their readiness not by their strength, but by the steadiness in their eyes. The trail led them upward again, the incline steeper than before. The earth crumbled beneath their feet in places, sending loose stones tumbling into the ravine below. Each step required focus, balance, and patience. Yet the silence between them felt natural, almost peaceful, the kind of silence that grows between people who no longer need words to share the same weight. At one narrow ridge, Haji Sahib paused to let the men catch their breath. Osama stood beside him, looking out across the vast expanse. A sprawling landscape opened before them, ridges overlapping like ancient waves, valleys carved by centuries of wind and war, and beyond it all, a faint plume of smoke rising from somewhere deep within the mountain's embrace. It was distant, but not distant enough to ignore. Haji Sahib exhaled softly. "That is from one of our old camps," he said. "The Soviets pushed through last night. They burn everything they find." Osama felt a cold tightness in his chest, a mixture of anger, sorrow, and something he couldn't name. The world he had stepped into was no longer theoretical. It was burning, literally, and the smoke rose like a question the mountains were asking him directly. Who will you become in this place? The group continued their ascent, wind brushing against their scarves, their breaths leaving faint clouds behind them. Hours passed in a slow, measured rhythm. The deeper they went, the more the air thinned, not just physically, but emotionally, as if the mountains were stripping away every comfort, every illusion. By midday, clouds gathered low, casting a muted gray shadow over the ridge. The path narrowed again, forcing them to move single file. Far below, the valley stretched out in muted colors, dotted with remnants of old encampments and abandoned trails. Then, as they turned a final bend, the sound reached them. Not an explosion, not gunfire, but chanting, soft, resonant, rhythmic. Haji Sahib lifted a hand, signaling them to stop. The voices rose from somewhere beyond the slope, steady, unified, layered with grief and strength. It was a recitation, a prayer, a group of mujahideen honoring the dead. Osama felt the sound settle into him, a vibration carried by the cold mountain wind. The chanting was both beautiful and haunting, an echo of devotion shaped by loss. Haji Sahib spoke quietly. "The camp is just ahead." Osama's heart beat with a slow, heavy calm. He didn't know what waited beyond the ridge. Survivors, remnants, bodies, hope, or despair. But he walked forward anyway, each step sealed with a quiet acceptance. Whatever the mountains chose to reveal next, he was ready to face it. The chanting grew clearer with every cautious step, weaving through the thin air like a solemn thread. It carried a weight that felt older than the conflict itself, a sound shaped by centuries of faith and mourning. As Osama and the others approached the final ridge, the rhythm of the voices deepened, creating a quiet trembling in the ground beneath their feet. When they reached the top of the slope, the valley opened before them. A small camp lay nestled in a hollow between the mountains, half sheltered by scattered pines and jagged rock. Tents leaned at tired angles, their fabric worn by wind and snow. Smoke drifted from a single fire pit, rising slowly toward the gray sky. Around the fire, a circle of fighters sat with bowed heads, their voices rising and falling in unison. It was not a scene of battle. It was a scene of remembrance. Their rifles lay beside them, untouched. Their faces were streaked with dust, their eyes hollow yet steady. These were men who had spent days fighting, nights retreating, and still found breath left only for prayer. Haji Sahib motioned for the group to stand at the edge of the circle and wait. The chanting continued for several minutes longer, soft enough to feel like a whisper yet strong enough to fill the valley. When it finally faded, A man at the far side of the fire lifted his gaze. He looked older than the others, not by age but by experience. His beard was dusted with snow, his cheeks hollow, but his eyes carried a sharp, unbroken clarity. He rose slowly and approached Haji Sahib, embracing him with a muted, weary relief. "You made it," he said, voice rough from cold and exhaustion. "We feared the ridge would be blocked." Haji Sahib shook his head. "The mountains tested us, but they spared us this time." The formation of al-Qaeda did not begin with a declaration, a banner, or a dramatic meeting in the desert. It began in whispers, in quiet rooms where men spoke in coded language, where fear mingled with fervor, and where Osama bin Laden felt the first pull toward something larger than a personal mission. The Soviet war in Afghanistan had ended, but for bin Laden, the real battle, the ideological one, was only beginning. He had tasted purpose in the mountains. Now he feared its absence. The withdrawal of Soviet troops left a vacuum in the hearts of thousands of fighters who had spent years believing they were part of a holy struggle. Many returned to their countries unsure of what came next. Others drifted, searching for meaning in the ruins of war. Bin Laden saw this chaos not as an end, but as an opportunity. A moment to mold the scattered energy of the Mujahideen into something unified, something permanent. He believed history was offering him a doorway. In the dim basements and safe houses of Peshawar, conversations grew more intense. Bin Laden sat with clerics, veterans, strategists, and zealots. Men who shared a common resentment toward Western influence, corrupt governments, and the shifting world order. They discussed not Afghanistan, but the globe. Not battles, but the long war. And as these discussions deepened, bin Laden increasingly found himself at the center. It wasn't arrogance. It was conviction. A conviction he would no longer keep private. Gradually, a vision took shape, one not limited to borders or governments. A network, bound not by nationality but by ideology. A force that could strike anywhere, without warning, using faith as both anchor and weapon. This was the seed of al-Qaeda. But in its early days, it was not yet a name or a formal title. It was a circle of influence, loose, fluid, uncertain. Bin Laden drew close to Ayman al-Zawahiri, the sharp-minded Egyptian surgeon who provided structure where bin Laden provided inspiration. Together, they spoke of awakening a global Muslim identity, of confronting regimes they saw as corrupt, and of resisting foreign powers they believed threatened their religion. These ideas were not new. What was new was bin Laden's ability to fund them. His wealth transformed ordinary discussions into concrete possibilities. Safe houses could be bought. Training camps could be built. Fighters could be fed, armed, and transported. Ideology, when funded, becomes strategy, and strategy, when organized, becomes action. Inside these camps, the atmosphere was a strange blend of discipline and fanaticism. Recruits memorized religious texts in the mornings and fired Kalashnikovs in the afternoons. They studied history through the lens of victimhood and destiny. They believed they were being prepared for a divine mission, one that elevated their suffering and sanctified their violence. And bin Laden, with his calm voice and unshakable certainty, stood at the center like a shepherd guiding a flock toward a horizon only he claimed to see. But behind the spiritual language lay a colder ambition. Bin Laden had begun to see himself not merely as a follower of great causes, but as an architect of one. His ideas grew sharper, more extreme. He saw compromise as weakness, diplomacy as betrayal, and patience as a divine test. In his mind, the world was no longer divided by nations or politics, but by belief. Those with him were soldiers of God. Those against him were obstacles to be removed. This transformation was subtle at first. Only those closest to him sensed the shift. The way his speeches grew longer, the way his eyes hardened when discussing the West, the way he withdrew from traditional scholars who questioned his interpretations. He was drifting toward isolation, even as his influence expanded. By the early 1990s, the informal network had grown into a structured entity, a hierarchy with commanders, trainers, financiers, and ideologues. Bin Laden's personal notes, scribbled in the margins of religious texts and scattered across diaries, outlined a vision of a global confrontation he believed was inevitable. He referred to al-Qaeda not as an organization but as a vanguard, a chosen few tasked with awakening the many. What made this moment dangerous was not simply the creation of a militant group. They existed in many forms across the region, but the fusion of global ambition, unwavering ideology, and substantial funding. Bin Laden possessed all three, and he believed history had placed them in his hands for a reason. As the network expanded, so did the secrecy surrounding it. Messages were carried by trusted couriers, never written. Recruits were vetted with increasing caution. Meetings occurred in isolated compounds where loyalty was tested more rigorously than combat skills. To be part of this rising force required total devotion, not to a nation, not to a cause, but to the man shaping it. And yet, Bin Laden did not see himself as a founder of terror. He saw himself as a custodian of divine duty. This was the paradox at the heart of his transformation. A man who believed absolute certainty was righteousness, even when it led to catastrophic decisions. He viewed the world through a lens that justified every action, no matter how violent, as a step toward a sacred objective. Meanwhile, outside the quiet circles of planning and preparation, the world remained unaware. Governments dismissed Bin Laden as a wealthy fanatic with limited reach. Intelligence agencies failed to grasp the depth of his ambition or the scope of his network. Journalists barely mentioned his name. But inside the safe houses, inside the dusty camps, inside the hidden gatherings where whispered prayers mixed with whispered plans, a storm was forming. Al-Qaeda had been born, not loudly, not publicly, but quietly, deliberately, and with a purpose that would soon reach far beyond the shadows. And as Bin Laden watched his small circle expand into a movement, he felt something he had not felt even in the mountains of Afghanistan. Destiny tightening around him like a cloak. He believed he was walking the path written for him. What he did not see, what he could not see, were the generations who would walk through its consequences. The early 1990s were a period of shifting identities and volatile transformations. Across the Middle East, governments wrestled with political unrest, economic struggles, and ideological fractures. In this landscape of uncertainty, Osama bin Laden's worldview hardened further, shaped not only by the battles he had witnessed, but by the interpretations he had crafted around them. The war had ended, but its narratives of victory, sacrifice, betrayal, and divine purpose echoed endlessly in his mind. And in those echoes, shadows began to form. Bin Laden returned to Saudi Arabia believing he had earned a moral authority that would be recognized and welcomed. He expected gratitude for his role in the Afghan jihad. What he encountered instead was indifference, if not outright dismissal. The royal family, secure in their political arrangements and alliances, saw no need for his advice or his warnings about Western influence. His ideas, once tolerated as passionate enthusiasm, were now viewed as a threat. This rejection struck him deeply. It was not just a personal insult, it was a spiritual contradiction. How could those who claimed to protect the Holy Lands align themselves so openly with foreign powers? How could a nation so rooted in religious identity embrace political alliances that Bin Laden believed corrupted the very foundations of faith? In his mind, this was not politics. It was betrayal. The Gulf War became a turning point. For Bin Laden, the presence of American troops on Saudi soil, the birthplace of Islam, was an unimaginable violation. When he publicly criticized the monarchy for allowing it, the consequences were swift. His speeches were banned. His movements were monitored. The royal court, once open to his family name, now treated him with suspicion. He felt cornered. He felt silenced. And in that silence, his ideology darkened. His criticisms evolved into accusations. His disagreements turned into declarations. He no longer merely opposed Western influence. He came to see it as an active enemy. He no longer questioned Muslim leaders. He condemned them. The world was becoming more polarized in his eyes, and with each passing year, the middle ground eroded. When Saudi Arabia revoked his passport, it was more than a political action. It was a rupture, one that severed his last emotional tie to the homeland he loved. Exile, however, did not weaken him. It sharpened him. He moved to Sudan, a nation struggling economically but ideologically open to his ideas. Here, he found the freedom to rebuild, to strategize, and to expand al-Qaeda's presence without the constraints he had faced in Saudi Arabia. Sudan's government, seeking investment, influence, and support, welcomed him. Farms, construction companies, and training camps sprouted under his financial umbrella. Money flowed, men gathered, and ideas spread. But beyond the visible developments lay a more critical transformation, the deepening of his ideological rigidity. Bin Laden surrounded himself not with moderating voices, but with those who mirrored his beliefs. Scholars who disagreed with him were dismissed as corrupt or misguided. Historical context became irrelevant. Texts were interpreted in isolation, stripped of nuance, molded to fit a narrative of cosmic conflict. This intellectual isolation became a self-reinforcing loop. The more he withdrew from mainstream scholarship, the more extreme his interpretations became. The more extreme his interpretations became, the more isolated he felt from the rest of the Muslim world. He saw this isolation not as a warning sign, but as confirmation that he and his followers were part of a chosen minority, the few who understood the truth. In meetings, his tone shifted. He spoke less as a preacher and more as a general, less as a student of faith and more as a guardian of it. He began to argue that local struggles were insufficient. The true enemy, he insisted, was global, a system of Western political, military, and cultural dominance that he believed sought to suppress Islam. To confront such a force, he claimed, required strategies that went beyond conventional warfare. This is where the shadows deepened. He spoke of hitting distant enemies, of creating pressure points that could reshape global politics, of forcing nations into responses that would reveal their vulnerabilities. It was an ideology that distanced itself from traditional resistance and moved toward a vision of orchestrated chaos. Inside al-Qaeda's circles, his ideas were met with enthusiasm. Outside them, the world remained unaware of how far his thinking had drifted. During these years in Sudan, Bin Laden's public persona remained calm, reserved, almost scholarly. He gave interviews where he spoke softly, quoting religious texts with precision, often presenting himself as a man concerned primarily with justice and dignity. But behind closed doors, a different narrative unfolded, one marked by radicalization, strategic planning, and an unwavering belief that confrontation was inevitable. He framed the struggle not as a political disagreement, but as an existential war. A war he believed was justified. A war he believed was sacred. And in this framing lay the seed of global catastrophe. Governments began to take notice. Western intelligence agencies monitored his activities with growing suspicion. Regional leaders expressed concerns about the influx of fighters and the spread of extremist rhetoric. Yet, even then, many underestimated him. They saw a wealthy exile with a handful of followers. Dangerous, perhaps, but not capable of altering the world. What they failed to see were the shadows he was weaving. Shadows that extended far beyond the deserts of Sudan. For Bin Laden, this period was not merely an exile. It was preparation. A time to gather resources, refine ideology, test loyalty, and build a network that could operate fluidly across borders. He believed he was laying the foundation not for an organization, but for a movement that would outlive him. A movement driven by a narrative of victimhood, vengeance, and divine mandate. By the mid-1990s, the ideological shadows that had once lingered quietly behind Bin Laden now formed the core of his identity. He no longer questioned the path he was on. He embraced it fully. His worldview was complete, and from that worldview emerged a sense of inevitability, a belief that confrontation with the world's most powerful nations was not only unavoidable, but ordained. What he did not realize, what he could not foresee, was how these shadows would eventually expand beyond his control, engulfing not only his followers, but the world he believed he was trying to save. In the end, the world Osama bin Laden had built around himself slowly collapsed inward, not with explosions or declarations, but with a quietness that felt almost unreal compared to the tumult of his earlier years. After decades of commanding vast networks, issuing proclamations, and shaping global conflict from the shadows, his universe shrank to a few narrow rooms, guarded pathways, and the dull echo of time moving without him. His life, once marked by movement, mountains, deserts, training camps, shifting fronts, began to freeze. Each year that passed in hiding stripped away layers of certainty. The sprawling influence he once wielded across continents narrowed into whispered messages delivered through couriers who themselves lived in fear. The world outside had changed. The networks that once stretched from Afghanistan to Africa were fractured, hunted, and scattered. Those who had once seen him as a symbol now saw him as a liability. And bin Laden, once the architect of sweeping ideological storms, became a man confined. In the quiet compounds of Pakistan, far removed from the rugged terrain that had once given him purpose, he found himself enclosed by walls he did not build, but walls shaped by the consequences of everything he had set in motion. The simplicity he had romanticized in earlier years now felt suffocating. He could no longer step outside freely. He could no longer speak openly. Even the sky above him was a thing to fear. The silence became his constant companion. His days took on a repetitive, almost ghost-like rhythm. He read, he wrote, he exercised in narrow spaces. He studied the world through old books, outdated recordings, and the fragments of news brought to him by trusted messengers. Yet the world he observed from afar was not the world he had imagined would emerge from his actions. Nations had united against him. New political landscapes had formed. Communities he believed he was defending turned away from his methods. And as the years passed, he could no longer deny that his ideology had unleashed suffering he never fully anticipated, or never cared to confront. There were moments, rare and private, when he seemed to wrestle with what his legacy had become. He had once believed he was shaping a revolution of spiritual clarity, a reawakening of faith in a world he saw as misguided. But the aftermath of his decisions was more complex, more devastating, more tragic than the narratives he created for himself. The stories of ruin, loss, and broken families traveled faster than his messages ever did. And somewhere in the solitude of those final years, even he could not escape the weight of what he had authored. But he did not turn back. He did not renounce. He simply drifted deeper into silence. Outside his compound, the world continued to search for him with relentless determination. Intelligence networks wove together leads, whispers, and fragments of information. Governments reshaped entire strategies around his capture. Wars were fought, alliances formed, and millions of lives altered because of the shadow he cast. And yet, behind the fading walls of his hiding place, he watched everything from a distance, powerless to influence the tide he had once commanded. Those who lived with him described a man aging in seclusion, white in beard, thin in frame, disciplined in routine. He scribbled thoughts in notebooks, wrote messages that rarely left the compound, and clung to the idea that he still had a role to play. But the world had outpaced him. The movement he once led had splintered into factions he no longer controlled, each carrying pieces of his ideology in directions he could not predict. His voice, once amplified across continents, now reached almost no one. Time, which had once seemed like a tool he wielded, became an enemy he could neither outrun nor command. The children who played in the courtyards of his compound knew him only as an old man with stories. His guards viewed him not as a symbol of global upheaval, but as a responsibility they were increasingly unsure how to manage. The silence deepened. The world closed in. When the night finally came that would mark the end of his long and turbulent journey, it arrived not as a dramatic confrontation driven by ideology, but as a swift and precise operation shaped by years of pursuit. There were no speeches, no declarations, no grand defense. Only the sound of helicopters slicing through the darkness, boots hitting the ground, and the final, irrevocable closing of a chapter that had haunted global history. For a man whose life had reshaped geopolitics, his final moments were startlingly quiet. The world he had fought against did not crumble. The nations he had challenged did not fall. Instead, the conflict he had ignited had reshaped into something larger, more complicated, and often far removed from the beliefs he once declared sacred. His death did not heal the wounds he had opened. It did not resolve the questions he had raised. It did not erase the suffering written in the margins of his ideology. But it marked an ending, a silent conclusion to the life of a man who had once commanded storms. In the days and years that followed, nations reflected not on the legend he had tried to build, but on the consequences he left behind. Families continued to grieve, societies rebuilt, political strategies shifted, and slowly, the world began to navigate an era shaped not by his presence, but by the echoes of his absence. Some saw his end as justice, some saw it as closure, others saw it simply as another turning point in a long and painful history. But universally, his final silence became a reminder of the fragility of peace, of the power and peril of ideology, and of how one life, driven by belief and hardened by conviction, can cast shadows across generations. His story concluded in a quiet room, far from the deserts that shaped him, far from the mountains that once defined him, and far from the world he sought to change. The silence he left behind was vast, heavy, and contemplative, an unfinished echo in the long struggle between belief, power, and human consequence. And in that silence, the world continued forward, carrying with it the lessons, the scars, and the unanswered questions of a history forever marked by his choices.